1885. The Girl in Room. Number 7. Strange Stories at Willard Mental Hospital. In 1885, the Willard Asylum for the Insane in New York, an institution known for its imposing buildings and strict management system, witnessed a strange story concerning Room 7 inches, the female ward. By the time Room 7 was sealed in the autumn of that year, no one in the hospital administration could agree if a girl had ever actually been kept there, or if the stories were only rumors passed among the staff. The hospital's official records list no patient admitted, discharged, or residing in Room 7 for the year 1885. However, the staff who had worked in that area all recounted the story of a small young girl with piercing cold eyes and a voice that emerged only in unexpected moments, often revealing private details that no one had ever shared with her. Some said she was harmless, just a withdrawn child, lost in the harsh environment of the asylum. Others recalled instances when she uttered their deepest secrets, thoughts that had never been spoken aloud, and a handful, years later, admitted that the girl seemed to understand them in a terrifying way, more deeply than they understood themselves. If you are captivated by this story, please leave a comment with your thoughts. What was Room 7 really used for? And where are you, and at what time, as you read this story? By the summer of 1885, the Willard Asylum for the Insane in New York had become a small city behind its stone walls. Built to be a model of humane care, the facility was now struggling with overcrowding. The female ward, a vast wing with long, deep corridors and perpetually locked doors, housed hundreds of women with a variety of diagnoses, from melancholia to hysteria. This section was known for isolating the difficult cases from the eyes of benefactors and supervisory committees. One morning in late July, an internal memorandum was sent to a small group of staff in the female ward. The content was brief. Patient P7 assigned to Room 7, female ward, special care protocol, restricted discussion. The memo was not signed by the chief physician or an administrative clerk. It did not list a date of admission, age, or any identifying information beyond the coded designation P7. In the hospital's official register, the column for Room 7 remained blank. Records from the New York State Health Authority also showed no admission of a young female patient at that time. Nurses later recalled that the girl arrived without an escort from the police or her family. She was led to the ward by an office clerk, who left immediately without a word to anyone. The hospital's main log for July made no mention of the admission of any female patient matching her description. Unofficially, the staff began calling her the Nameless Girl. Some speculated she might be the child of a powerful figure hidden away from public opinion. Others suspected she had been transferred from another institution after an incident that was not made public. But the complete absence of paperwork was not just unusual. It was a deliberate breach of the rules created to protect both the patient and the hospital itself. More telling was the fact that only a handful of staff in the female ward were given a key that could open the door to Room 7. No one could explain why a newly arrived young girl required a level of security typically reserved for the most dangerous patients. Her file, if one could call it that, contained no medical diagnosis, no behavioral notes, and no doctor's signature, only the memo that had been sent that morning. What unsettled some nurses the most was how quickly the situation was normalized. Within a week, new staff were instructed to deliver food and supplies to Room 7 without being allowed to ask questions. There were no open discussions in staff meetings, and no one tried to hide the fact that her name did not exist in any records. Willard's culture in 1885 was already accustomed to keeping secrets. But this was different. This wasn't just ordinary concealment. It was an intentional omission, a carefully orchestrated erasure so complete that it could only succeed if the space itself was hidden from view. The female ward of the Willard Asylum for the Insane occupied the entire west wing of the main building, a massive structure added during an 1872 expansion. Its design followed the principle of moral architecture, but years of piecemeal renovations had turned the corridors into a labyrinth. Some passageways ended abruptly at brick walls where windows overlooking the garden once stood. Other areas were subdivided into isolated cells with inconsistent and sometimes omitted numbering. Room 7 was located at the end of a narrow corridor known as the service hallway, a passage that most patients and staff never set foot in. This hallway was much darker and narrower than the main corridors, with walls painted a cold slate grey, a stark contrast to the off-white of the common areas. On one side were closets for linens, medicines, and cleaning supplies. On the other were two small isolation rooms that were rarely used. According to the hospital's official architectural plans, Room 7 was not designed for occupancy. On the floor plan submitted to the State Medical Board, this space was labeled medical supply storage. This meant that during routine inspections, which followed a fixed route through the common areas, therapy rooms, and dining hall, Room 7 never came into the view of inspectors, donors, or important guests. Its location required turning down the service hallway through a steel gate that was usually locked. The room itself had two layers of security. The first was a thick oak door, locked with a large iron lock, operated by a key issued only to a few select nurses. The second was the steel gate at the beginning of the hallway, installed just after the supply closets. This gate required a separate key, kept in the ward supervisor's office. This combination meant that entering Room 7 required two different keys held by two different people. From the hallway, the door had no number plate. The wall around it had been painted and repainted many times, covering up any old marks. In the daily flow of the ward, a stranger could walk down the main hall, see all the numbered rooms, and never know that Room 7 existed. Its presence was known only to the staff on the approved list, and its removal from public view was a deliberate, systematically maintained act. One nurse later wrote in her resignation letter that she felt unsettled by the way the room seemed to be listening. She did not elaborate, but in interviews years later, other staff members shared a similar feeling. It seemed as though the space itself separated the girl inside from the rest of the asylum, as if they both existed in a separate reality. What happened behind that door would only slowly be revealed as the girl inside began to be observed more closely. Not through her actions, but through the way she observed everyone else. During the first week, the girl, known as P7, was placed in Room 7. No incidents were recorded. Nurses noted her absolute compliance with every procedure. She stood when asked, ate on time, and submitted to hygiene checks without any resistance. She made no attempt to converse, ask questions, or oppose any aspect of her care. However, her silence was not passive. While sitting on the small iron bed, she would fix her eyes on anyone present in the room, following their every gesture with deliberate precision. The staff described a feeling of being scrutinized, as if they were being analyzed rather than simply watched. She did not fidget, rock, or pace. Instead, she seemed to be absorbing her surroundings down to the smallest detail, the angle of a key turning in a lock, the rustle of a uniform, down to the exact amount of time it took for a food tray to be set down and retrieved. By the 5th day, nurses noticed she was already standing by the door before they unlocked it to bring food, even when the schedule changed unexpectedly. This readiness persisted despite shuffled meal times, suggesting she was keenly aware of the work shifts and deviations in routine. The ward supervisor confirmed that the girl had no clock, and the window of her room was boarded up, making it impossible to see into the main corridor. Her mimicry was subtle but consistent. One nurse had a habit of tapping her fingers on the table while checking supplies. A few days later, the girl repeated the exact motion while sitting alone. A security guard would often run a hand through his hair after unlocking the hallway gate. She would do the same shortly after, though seemingly without intention. These repetitions were accurate enough to be recognizable, yet completely detached from any context that might explain them. A note by Nurse Margaret Cole on August 10 simply read, "She is studying us." There was no further explanation. But in later testimony, Cole described a moment when the girl mirrored her posture exactly, arms crossed, head tilted slightly to the right, all while maintaining a cold, unblinking stare. Cole left the room immediately, citing personal discomfort. Viewed in isolation, These details might have been dismissed as the natural vigilance of a young girl in a strange place, but the uniformity of these accounts across multiple staff members suggested something more deliberate, an active and continuous cataloging of the people assigned to her care. It wasn't until her second month of stay that this silent observation gave way to speech, and when it came, the words she chose were neither random nor her own. The first recorded verbal incident from the girl occurred on August 15. Head nurse Margaret Cole entered the room to bring breakfast. Without any preamble, the girl said, "You hid your mother's ring in the medicine box." Cole, whose mother had passed away 3 weeks prior and had indeed hidden the ring in a small tin box in the medical room, was completely stunned. She had never told anyone this detail. From then on, her speech, though extremely rare, always followed a pattern. Days, or even weeks, of silence would pass, then be broken by a short, clinically delivered statement containing a fact about the listener, something private, specific, and very recent. These statements were completely devoid of conversational context. No questions, no greetings, just the bare truth. On September 5, another nurse, Sarah, recorded an incident where the girl recited the exact phrase her father had written in his last letter to her. Sarah had only read that letter the night before in her private room in a completely different building. The girl could not possibly have overheard it. By the end of September, 2 other staff members had reported similar incidents. One was told the exact amount of money he had lost playing cards over the weekend. Another was asked nonchalantly, "Is your son's fever gone yet?" when no one at the hospital knew her son had been ill. There was no evidence of notes, letters, or smuggled information. The girl's room was frequently searched. Nothing was ever found to suggest she was keeping records. This lack of evidence did little to ease the anxiety of those assigned to her care. A few nurses began to avoid making eye contact with her, rushing in and out of the room, and sometimes leaving tasks half-finished just to shorten their time inside. Whispered conversations among the staff gave rise to the theory that she was keeping a mental ledger, a living repository of everything she heard and saw, just waiting for the right moment to use it. Some believed she was simply repeating things she had overheard. Others countered that there was no way she could have been within earshot of conversations that took place in distant parts of the hospital. Regardless of the explanation, the effect was consistent. Those who worked near her became more reserved, careful with every word spoken anywhere on the premises. Her influence, whether accidental or intentional, was reshaping the entire social climate of the ward. It was in this atmosphere of vigilance and anxiety that another change began to emerge, one that was not confined to room 7. The female patients in adjacent rooms began exhibiting behaviors that suggested the girl's influence was spreading beyond her own locked door. By September, the strange reports surrounding room 7 were no longer limited to the girl herself. The logs for the female ward began to note subtle but distinct changes in the behavior of patients in the adjoining rooms, particularly rooms 5, 6, and 8. The first incident involved a 16-year-old girl admitted for emotional instability. During a morning check, a nurse found her sitting silently on her bed, staring at the door, perfectly mimicking P7's posture. When asked what she was doing, the girl did not respond and did not break her gaze from the door until she was shaken by the shoulders. A week later, another patient, known for her compulsive lying, began answering questions with short, emotionless statements, identical to the girl in room 7's manner of speaking. Her rhythm and intonation were a perfect match for P7. No lead-in, just facts. In one instance, she told a nurse, "You kept the letter in your apron pocket," a detail the nurse had never disclosed and could not have been discovered through normal interaction. By October, a third patient was reported to be mimicking not only the girl's motionless posture, but also her habit of tracking staff members' movements with a sharp, piercing gaze. The staff found this imitation so unnerving that they recorded it in the log as behavioral contagion. Source unknown. Notably, none of these patients were permitted any contact with P7. Meals were served individually, and there were no communal activities that would have brought them into proximity. Their only shared connection was the thin wall between their rooms. Some staff began to wonder if sound could travel through the walls, though the hospital's thick brick and plaster construction made direct communication impossible. No one could explain how these specific gestures and speech patterns were being replicated so perfectly. This effect began to impact the ward's management. The supervisor increased patrols in the service hallway, while some staff members began requesting transfers to other areas of the hospital. The unease stemmed not just from the girl in room 7, but from the prospect that her presence was altering the behavior of those who had never even seen her face. In late October, the situation escalated further, not among the patients, but among the staff themselves. The first resignation came from a security guard who had been assigned to the service hallway for just over 2 months, citing severe headaches, insomnia, and a feeling of being mentally invaded whenever he worked near room 7. On the 10th of October 1885, security guard James Harrow submitted his resignation from the female ward. In his statement to the supervisor, he cited severe headaches, fitful sleep, and an unshakable feeling that his mind was being invaded during shifts assigned to the service hallway. Harrow's duties had placed him in proximity to room 7 for nearly 8 consecutive weeks. Although he was not one of the direct caregivers, he was frequently responsible for patrolling the surrounding area, spending many hours each night within earshot of that corridor. Medical records from the hospital physician noted his condition as nervous exhaustion, a common diagnosis for stress-related symptoms at the time. The medical report noted his pallor, trembling hands, and difficulty concentrating on simple tasks. When asked about the cause, Harrow recounted that the headaches began in late August and had progressively worsened. Sleep had become an ordeal. He would often wake up with the feeling that he had just heard something, even in his dreams. His departure prompted quiet discussions among the long-term staff. This was not the first time an employee from that section of the hospital had left for similar reasons. 3 years earlier, in 1882, a nurse named Clara had resigned, complaining of fatigue, headaches, and what she described as a feeling of being constantly watched. In 1879, another employee left the female ward after only a few months with identical symptoms. None of the previous cases had been officially linked to a specific patient or room, but in every instance, these employees had been stationed at the same service hallway. Given the chronic staff shortages, high turnover was not unusual. However, the alarming similarity in symptoms, combined with the fact that all of them had been healthy individuals before their assignment, was privately noted by at least one supervisor. The official record logged Harrow's resignation as voluntary, with no indication of anything unusual. He was said to have moved to work on a farm in the countryside, a job that allowed him more time outdoors. There are no documents tracking his health status after he left Willard. His position in the female ward was filled within a week by a new nurse recruited from a nearby town. The replacement received only a brief orientation before being added to the access list for room 7. It was during this period of staff transition that a new administrative directive was issued, one that was notable for its strangeness and complete lack of explanation. The memo, short and unsigned, contained a single line: "Do not tell at the time." On the 15th of November, 1885, an internal memorandum was privately delivered to the small group of staff with clearance for room 7. It consisted of a single sentence typed on hospital letterhead, without a signature: "Do not tell at the time." Below, in smaller type, the directive was supplemented: "Do not discuss events outside the hospital in its presence." No rationale accompanied this order. There was no mention of behavioral incidents, no medical justification, and no indication of who had authorized the directive. The copies were handed out personally, not posted publicly in the staff room. In the absence of an explanation, speculation began to spread. Some nurses believed it was part of a medical experiment, an attempt to observe the effects of temporal disorientation on a patient. Others suspected the purpose was to prevent the girl from tracking the passage of time, perhaps to conceal the true length of her confinement. A few argued that the order was not for the girl's sake, but to protect the staff by denying her information she could use in her unnerving statements. Whatever the reason, compliance required new habits. Common conversational phrases like, "Good morning," "It's almost dinner time," or "It's a beautiful day," were forbidden in her presence. When bringing meals, staff were instructed to avoid answering any questions about the weather, outside events, or anything related to the world beyond the walls. One nurse recorded that she found herself rehearsing innocuous phrases before entering the room to ensure she didn't slip up. For her part, the girl showed no sign of noticing the change. She continued to accept food and follow instructions as before, observing with the same intense focus, but she made no comment on the absence of temporal cues. However, a few nurses reported a vague feeling that she was fully aware of this deliberate omission, that her gaze seemed to linger longer during each of their visits, as if assessing the strain they were under to avoid certain words. Months later, the only surviving copy of this memorandum was found in the archives. It showed strange alterations. Parts of the page, including the hospital's letterhead, had been blotted out with thick ink. Only the sentence, "Do not tell it," the time, remained legible. The rest, including any original signatures or notes, had been obliterated. In the weeks following the directive, staff vigilance reached its peak, and conversations within the ward became quieter and more cautious than ever. It was in this tense atmosphere of self-censorship that a discovery was made, one that blurred the line between silent observation and the girl's active intrusion. A nurse, during a routine room check, found a small notebook under the girl's bed. Inside, several pages were filled with handwriting, unmistakably the nurse's own. However, she had no memory of ever having written anything in that room. On the 12th of December, 1885, a nurse named Anna was conducting a routine room check in room 7. The procedure was simple: confirm the bedding was intact, check the door lock, inspect the floor for contraband, and clear the food tray. That morning, as she bent down to pick up a wooden comb that had fallen under the bed, she found a small notebook wedged between the wall and the bed frame. The notebook was the type issued to nurses for quick notes, cheap paper with a simple binding. However, this notebook did not contain medical notes. The first 3 pages were filled with hurried lines of text written in pencil. Anna immediately recognized it as her own handwriting. The writings were personal thoughts, worries about her sick father, an argument with her fiancé, and lines of poetry she often wrote to relieve stress. These were things Anna only wrote in her private diary, a diary she always kept in her personal locker. She couldn't remember ever bringing this notebook into room 7. More frighteningly, she couldn't remember writing these lines here at all. The handwriting was a perfect match to hers in slant, spacing, and pressure, but the pencil stroke seemed a bit darker, as if written with a ferocity she did not possess. Anna did not report this discovery to her supervisor. Instead, she quietly slipped the notebook into her pocket, later burning it in the staff room fireplace that night. When asked years later, she said her decision not to report it was due to a certainty that no one would understand. There is no record of the notebook in the ward's logs. Its existence was not reported or documented. At least one other nurse to whom Anna confided advised her to forget about it. The presence of her most private writings in the girl's possession, whether written unconsciously by Anna or not, raised profound concerns about the safety of the staff. These notes contained vulnerabilities the girl could exploit. Combined with the previous instances of personal revelations, this notebook was proof of a shift from passive observation to an active and terrifying form of information gathering. Within 2 weeks of this discovery, new regulations were implemented for Room 7. At first, the changes were subtle: tighter key control, shortened contact times, and a limit on the number of nurses permitted to enter. But by January 1886, these measures had escalated into a strict policy of containment, a policy that completely altered the rhythm of life in the service hallway. By the first week of January, the protocols at Room 7 had shifted from unusual to exceptional. The door, which had previously been opened briefly for cleaning and meal delivery, was now kept locked at all times. Entry required both the iron lock on the door and the steel gate outside to be opened, a process deliberately slowed down by assigning the 2 keys to 2 different staff members. A second measure was implemented without official announcement. No single staff member was allowed to enter the room alone. Any interaction with the girl, no matter how brief, required the presence of 2 employees, one to perform the task, the other to stand guard at the door. Officially, this was explained as an enhanced security standard, though no other patient in the entire female ward was subject to similar conditions. The intervals between contact were also extended. Whereas meals had previously been delivered at fixed times, they were now brought at random to avoid predictability. Routine checks were reduced from every half hour to every hour, and sometimes even longer when the ward was understaffed. No medical reason for this change was ever recorded, although a handwritten note in the supervisor's logbook, later partially crossed out, read, "Minimize contact, minimize exposure." In February, another barrier was erected. A chest-high iron bar door was installed in the hallway wall just before the room's door. It required a separate key and prevented anyone from approaching the room's entrance without special orders. To the rest of the ward, this gate was a clear symbol of the girl's complete isolation from the life of the hospital. Throughout this time, the girl remained calm and cooperative. She stood up when meals were brought in, moved to the back of the room when requested, and submitted to brief inspections without a word of protest. However, her watchfulness did not diminish. Nurses reported that she followed their every movement during each visit, turning her head to track them until they were out of sight. There are no records indicating that she ever tried to escape or cause any disturbance. Yet, the security measures continued to intensify, seemingly designed not to control her, but to manage the mental state of those who worked near her. By the end of the month, the service hallway had developed an unspoken rule: keep time near the gate to a minimum. Tasks near room 7 were completed hastily, with staff quickly moving away to avoid any pauses. Those who lingered, whether by choice or by necessity, often left the hallway looking startled, unable to explain why. It was during one of these brief pauses, in the late hours of a quiet shift, that a young nurse was found collapsed outside the door of room 7, dead before help could arrive. On the night of the 25th of November, 1885, a young nurse named Ellen Price, 22, was assigned to bring drinking water to room 7. She was seen opening the hallway gate at 11:15 p.m. Her task was to wait for another nurse, who would arrive a few minutes later. When the second nurse arrived, she found Price standing alone in front of the closed door, still clutching the water pitcher. According to the surviving account, the second nurse called out to Price from the end of the hallway, but received no reply. Price then suddenly staggered backward, the water pitcher shattering on the floor, and she collapsed against the wall. The nurse frantically called for help, but by the time other staff members arrived, Price had stopped breathing. The on-duty physician determined she had died of sudden cardiac failure. Her body showed no signs of violence, no bruises or injuries. The only unusual detail in the doctor's report was the description of Price's expression at the time of her death. Her eyes were wide open, fixed, her features frozen in a look of absolute terror. No official investigation was conducted beyond the internal incident report. The doctor's conclusion did not suggest foul play, and the county coroner's office was not notified. Price's body was released to her family the very next day, and the official record shows no further inquiry. After the incident, room 7 was kept locked for 5 days. During this time, no meals were delivered, and the girl inside was not spoken to or observed. The supervisor's log for those days contains only a single line: no access. Room 7. When the door was finally reopened on the 5th day, the girl was found sitting on the bed, facing the door. She complied with the order to stand up and move aside for cleaning. She made no comment, asked no questions, and showed no reaction to the interruption in her care. Within a week, the administrative office issued a brief order. Patient P7 was to be relocated from the ward. There were no details about where she was going, no note of a transfer, and no name to track through official channels. By the morning of December 3, room 7 was empty. On the morning of the 3rd of December 1885, nurses opened the door to room 7 for a routine check and found the room empty. The bed was neatly made. There were no personal belongings, and there was no sign that anyone had been there overnight. The girl was gone. On the ward supervisor's desk was a single folded sheet of paper with the typed words, "P7 has been relocated." The note was unsigned and bore no date other than the hospital's automatic stamp. There was no mention of a destination, no initials indicating who had given the order, and no medical file or discharge form attached. When questioned, none of the night shift staff remembered seeing her being taken away. No carriage was logged as having left the main gate that night. The hospital's patient movement register had no entries for the female ward on that date. By noon, the incident had been absorbed into the hospital's familiar rhythm of silence. Staff were reassigned, and no official announcement was made. Only those who had clearance for room 7 knew the space was vacant, and even among them, all discussion was brief and hushed. Within 48 hours, The maintenance crew entered the room and began dismantling everything inside. The iron bed, table, and chair were removed. The linens were burned, and the wash basin and pitcher were put into storage. By the end of the week, the room was completely bare. Stripped floorboards, faint outlines on the walls where furniture had rested, and the ghostly shadow of the bed frame etched into the dust. The steel gate in the hallway remained, still locked, but the key was no longer kept in the supervisor's office. Its new location was unknown to anyone. The staff were simply ordered to leave the gate alone, unless given direct instructions from the administration. There is no further mention of the girl in the remaining ward logs. There is no record of her arrival at any other institution, nor any note of her death. In the archival timeline, her presence ends as abruptly as it began, leaving no official trail to follow. It would be several more weeks before a final decision was made, one intended to ensure that no one, not inspectors, not benefactors, and certainly not new staff, could ever access Room 7 again. That order was issued under a completely different pretext. In January 1886, less than a month after P7's unexplained disappearance, the service hallway was temporarily closed for what was announced as emergency structural renovations. No construction crew was noted in the official maintenance log, and no repair order was sent to the hospital's central office. When the hallway reopened 2 weeks later, Room 7 had been rendered completely inaccessible. The thick oak door had been locked, bolted, and then completely covered from the outside with a seamless layer of tongue and groove wood paneling. The steel gate outside remained in place, but it was now tightly bound with a thick, rusty chain. The reason given in a brief notice to staff was instability in the west wall structure, Room 7. The notice stated that the space would be sealed indefinitely pending repairs, though no date or contractor name was ever mentioned. In the years that followed, no invoices, receipts, or repair notes ever surfaced to substantiate this claim. A week after the room was sealed, the walls of the service hallway were completely repainted. The new coat of paint erased the outline of the door, making it blend in as one with the wall. To anyone unfamiliar with the wing's old layout, the space looked like a solid, continuous wall. Many former nurses, when interviewed decades later, commented on a strange stillness in that area after it was closed off. The hallway had never been loud, but the absolute absence of sound from behind the wall was described as dense and heavy, as if the space itself had been severed from the rest of the world. The hospital map, updated later that year, reflected this change. Where Room 7 had once existed, even if only labeled as storage, the new map showed only a blank wall between two other rooms. The numbering sequence jumped straight from Room 6 to Room 8 without any explanation. During inspection tours, officials passed through the hallway without ever knowing a patient room had once existed there. This alteration was accepted without question. The hospital, long skilled in the art of managing appearances, offered no further comment. The high rate of staff turnover ensured that within a few years, hardly anyone was left who even remembered the room's existence. For the few who did, it was a topic that was never mentioned. It wasn't until 1890, during a state records audit, that Room 7 would return, not as a physical space, but as a mysterious gap in the hospital's paperwork. The work of the auditors, unlike that of the hospital, did not rely on memory alone. In the autumn of 1890, the New York State Board of Health sent a team of auditors to Willard Asylum to review its archival records. Their assignment was part of a larger campaign to standardize patient record-keeping and ensure compliance with new state regulations. The audit took place in the hospital's administrative office, where carefully bound patient registers dating back decades were kept in an iron safe. Each volume listed, by date, the patient's name, assigned room, and notes on discharge, death, or transfer. When the auditors reached the 1885 register for the female ward, they noted the numbering sequence was consistent with the architectural maps of the time. But for Room 7, the column where a patient's name or a note should have been was completely blank. This wasn't the vacant notation typically used for rooms under repair, nor was it the empty space left when a bed was unused for inspection purposes. The space had been intentionally left void, the inked line of the ledger running straight through it, unbroken. Attached to the top of the page with a rusted paper clip was a yellowed, but still intact, piece of grid paper. The handwriting was neat, the pencil strokes firm and clear. It read, "Do not record the patient, but the ones who stayed too long." There was no signature, no date, and no indication of who the author was. This note was not included in the auditor's official report, which simply flagged the missing data in the Room 7 column, as requires clarification. In his personal journal, one of the auditors recorded that the hospital superintendent could offer no explanation for the omission, stating only that the service hallway had been under special restrictions at the time and promising to locate supplementary documents later. Those documents were never found. The auditors completed their work without further incident, but that blank column haunted them. In a medical facility where even the smallest absences were meticulously documented, the deliberate erasure of a name was extremely noteworthy, and the attached note suggested this absence was not an administrative error. The handwriting, though calm, bore the marks of someone familiar with internal record-keeping, even spacing, clear lettering, and no flourishes. Whether the author was a nurse, a manager, or an outside inspector remained an unanswered question. It was in the process of further investigating this omission, by cross-referencing the personnel records of those assigned to the service hallway in 1885, that a more frightening pattern emerged. Following the 1,890 audit, one of the clerks tasked with reconciling patient files against personnel logs began comparing the staff roster for the female ward in 1885 with subsequent records. The result was a pattern that could not be explained by normal attrition. Every nurse, guard, and employee with clearance for Room 7 inches 1885 had left Willard Asylum within 18 months of their assignment. The official reasons varied, but they all fell into three main categories: nervous breakdown, extended health leave, and abrupt resignation without notice. Not one of them ever returned to work at the hospital in any capacity. For those recorded as having left for medical reasons, the hospital's own physicians cited symptoms like chronic headaches, fatigue, and an inability to perform their duties. The cases of abrupt resignation were documented very sparsely, often with just a single line in the personnel log, sometimes without even a specific date. The effect was systematic. In less than 2 years, not a single member of the original authorized group was still employed at the hospital. Cross-referencing these findings with previous decades revealed even more anomalies. In 1878, a similar list existed for a small, unnamed isolation cell in the men's high-security ward. Within the following year, all staff associated with that space had either resigned or transferred to facilities in other counties. In 1869, a seclusion room in the area for chronic patients showed the same pattern: rapid staff turnover, vague medical discharges, and resignation letters that offered no satisfactory explanation. In all three cases, these rooms were later converted into storage or completely erased from new architectural maps. None of them retained their original numbers. The records did not link these spaces by name or purpose, but the pattern of staff turnover and subsequent erasure was identical. This led to quiet speculation among those with access to the cross-referenced records that Room 7 was not an isolated incident, but the most recent iteration of a long-standing practice, repurposing certain spaces for sensitive cases that were never officially recorded, and then erasing all traces of both the patient and the staff from the institution's operational history. This discovery did not lead to any official inquiry. No memorandum was issued to clarify the pattern. No external agency was contacted, and no effort was made to preserve this connection in the hospital's records. Instead, this information remained in the private notes of the auditing clerk, who left Willard later that year for personal reasons. What remained in the official archive was all the more powerful in its silence. The register entry for Room 7 and the personnel files of the staff connected to it were bundled together into a separate file, a file stamped in red ink with the words, "Medical Privilege." This stamp was not a diagnosis. It was a final seal. In the autumn of 1893, the administrative ledger for the female ward at Willard Asylum received its final notation regarding Room 7. The file containing its staff rosters, incomplete memos, and blank registration entry was stamped in red ink. Closed. No further inquiry. Inside the file, a single sheet bore the final written statement: Case secured under medical privilege. There were no signatures, no dates other than the year, and no explanation as to what had qualified this case for such a designation. The file was moved from the regular storage shelf to a locked cabinet in the superintendent's office. From that point on, the absence of Room 7 was treated as a settled part of history. No further references to the girl appeared in the hospital's operational logs, inspection notes, or patient indices. Staff hired after 1890, when asked decades later, all stated they had no knowledge that a numbered room had ever existed between Room 6 and Room 8 inches, the service hallway. That physical space remained sealed for more than a decade. In 1905, a major renovation plan called for the demolition of part of the West Wing to expand space and improve ventilation. During this construction, the area containing Room 7 was completely torn down. No records list the recovery of any items from within. The location where the door once stood was rebuilt as a seamless corridor wall. By the time the new blueprints were approved, the ward's numbering had been reorganized. The sequence now ran continuously, with no missing numbers to suggest a room had ever been removed. The institution's memory followed its architecture. Tours, audits, and annual reports made no mention of a gap in the building's layout. For the staff and administrators who worked after the turn of the 20th century, Room 7 existed only in the fading recollections of a few retired employees' memories they rarely shared, and never in detail. When the state began centralizing its medical archives in the 1922nd, the file marked medical privilege was transferred to a secure state storage facility. Its contents were cataloged but never digitized, and the restricted access note prevented any regular staff from reviewing it. The inventory sheet simply listed unidentified female patient with no reference to a room number. No effort has ever been made to reopen the case or to account for the blank space in the 1885 patient register. Room 7 remains unmentioned in any official summary of Willard Asylum's history. The paper trail ends exactly where the institution intended it to, with a closed file, a missing space, and an absence that, on paper, has no reason to exist. Room 7 does not exist on any current map of the Willard Asylum for the Insane. Its number is missing from the room sequences, its records are permanently sealed, and the staff who once worked near it have scattered without explanation. No one can say where the girl went, or if there was ever really a girl to begin with, but the blank space in the register remains, clipped with an anonymous, handwritten note. Do not record the patient, but the ones who stayed too long. If you were captivated by this story, leave a comment with your thoughts. What was Room 7 really used for? And where are you? And at what time as you hear this story?